That's a really
sure.
important, that if the whole idea is, to have the same service every day is boring. So we're going to write piyyutim. And then people selected which piyyutim they say, and they said the same ones every year.
And they made it boring. Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices, where I'm here today with Dr. Gabriel Wasserman, who got his PhD from Yeshiva University in New York, and then did a postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Shalom, Gabriel.
Hi. I'll mention yesterday, I actually, friend of mine said that, there's this WhatsApp group, last minute Shabbat meals. Let me find you a meal to go to. And I said, okay, that's cool. I'll go. The average age at the people at this meal was probably around 23. Mm-hmm. And there were some quite immature people there. And when they went around the room and said, what do you do? And I said, I study piyyut. And there was this immature young man who's like, oh yeah, he's like, first he's like, oh, you're into that garbage. How could anybody be into piyyut? And then he's like, and then I said, well, like I've always, like since I was a child, I felt that like when you have the same liturgy every day, day after day, week after week, it gets boring. It gets fixed. But the idea of keeping the structure so that you're still very much within the tradition, but you say the words change. That's very, that's very, I find, inspiring. So he said, oh yeah, saying in your own words. He says, yeah, God made butterflies. That's awesome. God, butterflies are so cool. And he's like saying in that kind of voice. And he's like, and I said, and somebody said, the host system, host who was himself only 25 years old, said, but more mature than these others. He says, what are you doing? He says, I'm saying a piyyut. And I said, that's not a piyyut. Dispositively, because I think I mean, aside from everything else, it wasn't poetry.
Right.
But, and of course, he was intentionally trying to mock. So but the main thing is that he had there was no structure to it. Now, I don't want to say that it doesn't become that later on standalone piyyutim don't get written. They do. Ezra Fleischer, according to his strict definitions, would probably not use the word piyyut for them, and I hesitate for that. A piyyut that's just like a prayer on its own. Like,
so when I was growing up, and we went to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, I'm like, what is taking 12 hours, 10 hours, or 8 hours? And that was the piyyut. So that's not considered piyyut? But what
it was the regular services expanded by piyyut. The brachot were the same. Baruch atah Magen Avraham. Baruch atah
It just took an hour and a half to get to Magen Avraham.
Exactly.
Okay,
I'm saying,
fair enough. So it wasn't really a standalone piyyut.
But that's very easy to miss when the only time you say piyyut is on Yom Kippur. Because when the whole year, everything is very bare bones. And so you go to a community where there's piyyut very often, then you see, okay, on Kippur, the piyyut's much longer, but it's that same phenomenon of expanding.
So what you're saying is if you went to synagogue in the Galilee in the 5th or 6th or early 7th century, when you heard the cantor reciting the Shemona Esrei, he would also intersperse it with piyyut. Or piyyut would be part of the structure of the Shemona Esrei.
Piyyut would be his Shemona Esrei. The only thing that wouldn't be with the very short doxologies at the end.
Okay. And that's really interesting. And so was it the intention? You're saying the intention really was to keep it interesting?
I think so. Well, that's what Fleischer thinks.
So look, we have the classical paitanim, the poets, Kalir and Yanai.
His name was Elazar
Kilir. Okay.
Kilir. Yeah, Kilir.
I say Kalir. All right.
I say Kalir too, but since we're... But
fair enough.
The point is, his name was Elazar.
Okay. So you have
his father's name was something like Cyril. Kyrios.
Okay. Interesting.
And so he was Elazar ben Berebi, Elazar, son of my master, Kilir. Kalir, however you want to pronounce it.
All
The
right.
point is,
So was he a?
his name was not Kalir. It's not a last name. It's not. People say Ha Kalir, the Kalir. No, it's. Do you see? His name was Elazar.
So did he write these poems? Did he write these piyyutim, these liturgical poems, because he was a cantor in a synagogue, or was he writing it for other people? What's that?
So almost certainly.
Oh, really? Okay, didn't know that. So he was doing it for his own usage, is what you're saying?
Yes, and he would get up. And by the way, so the piyyutim of the and I don't want to say the karovot and the yotzur karovot, and karova is a sequence of piyyutim meant to cover the whole Shemona Esrei.
Okay.
And there are other kinds of piyyutim yotzer, but the karovot of the Kaliri that made it to European rites generally were only, you'd have one for the first service on Rosh Hashanah, and one for the second service on Rosh Hashanah, and one for the service on. So here's the problem: on the first day of Sukkot, and on the second day of Sukkot. So this is getting a little involved, but Rabbinite Jews within the land of Israel have one day of the festivals. And there are also week-long festivals, but the middle days are of less stringencies. And Rabbinites in the diaspora have 2 days of festivals. This is a simplification. I don't want to get further into it because it's a real digression.
Okay.
Point is, so when in the 19th century, scholars were trying to figure out who was Elazar ben Kalir and where did he live? So they noticed that they had one karova for him for Shavuot, for the Pentecost. And they had 2 for Rosh Hashanah, but one was for the morning service and one was for the secondary, the Musaf, the additional service. And but they noticed there were 2 for Sukkot, which in Ashkenazic Machzorim, Ashkenazic prayer, festival prayer books, are recited on the first day and on the second day. So they said, wait a minute. If he wrote 2, he must have had 2 days. He must not have lived in Palestine. So now we know that this is all completely wrong because we see that you look in the Cairo Geniza, which is a storeroom. You've probably talked about it before, a storeroom in a synagogue in Cairo where so much has been discovered that wasn't known at all before. We spoke earlier in the when you asked about wasn't recorded, right? About Shmuel HaShlishi, that book.
Yeah, we talked before the recording about how there was this Paitan, a liturgical poet, who was completely unknown, and his writings were discovered only in the Cairo Geniza. Yeah, and you wrote a whole book or you were involved in a book written about him.
So we now see, there are 5 or 6 karovot by Elazar ben Kalir for Shavuot. There are, I forget how many for Yom Kippur. So did he keep 5 days of Shavuot? No, he clearly, every time he got up, maybe sometimes he reused an old one. I mean, but sometimes he would get up and probably people loved that when he got up and when he got up and there's going to be a new one this year. And people were probably enthralled that to hear the world premiere.
Interesting. Very interesting. So that's really interesting. So before the Cairo Geniza, they had this very small corpus, very small repertoire of his material, and they jumped to incorrect conclusions based on that. That's really
partly because what piyyut had meant to be to constantly refresh the service, then it had gotten fixed.
Now I want to ask a question.
You see what I'm saying? That's really
sure.
important. That if the whole idea is, to have the same service every day is boring. So we're going to write piyyutim. And then people selected which piyyutim they say, and they said the same ones every year.
And they made it boring.
It's not the same thing. What?
And they made it boring.
And they got bored again. But I'll tell you, there's not the same thing to have the same prayer every single day and to have the same prayer every single year. To have a composition that you haven't had recited in a whole year is still something refreshing and renewing, which is not the same as having the same service every day. Agreed?
Or every week, yeah.
Or every week or every month. Meaning it's still even more amazing when the poet can just get up and he's just like, it's just like just like what would you call it? Like
ad-libbing?
Rap duels, rap duels where you.
So are you saying that you're not suggesting that they were ad-libbing these? And in other words,
I think the really talented ones might have.
Really? Wow.
Oh, in fact, hold on. In Megillat Achimat, is there a story of someone who did? No, the story is that he changed some of the words, but he had upset. It has to do with he had upset someone, and they were really angry at him, and then he came from Italy to the land of Israel, and he was there, and he changed some poem, which was a known poem, or at least known to him. And he changed the words to, instead of cursing the enemies of the Jews, he cursed the Karaites instead, because he was trying to suck up to the rabbis in Jerusalem, and because they didn't like him. And when he did that, they made up to him. So it was an ad-libbing of a line, but I think there was probably some ad-lib. I want to screen share something with you.
Sure. Let me ask you this. So are you saying, so when Kaliri or Yanai wrote a poem, did they actually write it down and then bring that parchment into the synagogue with them? Or do we have no idea?
How should I know?
We don't know. Okay.
I will tell you the story, though. It's from hundreds of years later in Europe. Mm-hmm. Takes place in northern Italy.
Yeah.
Shlomo Habavli, Shlomo ben Yehuda, spends a year writing the Yotzer sequence, which is Yotzer Or is the first blessing before the Shema, a different part of the liturgy, actually both in Rabbinite and in Karaite liturgy. Mm-hmm. And so Yotzerot, we were talking about Karovot, which go in the Shemona Esrei. Yotzerot go through the various blessings, the brachot around the Shema. Fine. Mm-hmm. He wrote this very, very, very complicated poem, which goes through every single verse of the Song of Songs and uses each verse either as a beginning of a line of a stanza or in the end of a stanza. Mm-hmm. So like the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, he will kiss me with the lips of his mouth, the aroma. So it'll say like the light, and he's talking about light because the first Baracha Yotzor is about light. The light and rescue of the happy ones, of the fortunate ones who observe this observance, Passover. Mm-hmm. I will thank him with songs like those that sing the Song of Songs. So you see the words, the Song of Songs, are the end of that stanza. The next stanza, the last clause will be his kisses. May he kiss me. The third, so they say he spent a year writing it. It's extraordinarily complicated, and if you want to understand it, you really need to spend a lot of time, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about lines in it, what they mean. So his student, Meshulam, son of Kalonimos, was there. And he said, that was really good. Tomorrow, because they had 2 days of the festival in Italy, tomorrow, I'm going to do the same. So given the prohibition of writing on the festival, he wouldn't have written it down. He would have composed it in his head. Mm-hmm. That second night, keep in mind, would have been the Passover Seder. He would have been quite occupied. Mm-hmm. He got up the next morning and he said his piyyut, which also is based on all the verses of the Song of Songs in them, and that in Ashkenazic communities today, sadly today very little, but certainly in my community in Washington Heights and in communities that perpetuate the tradition, that one said the first day and that one said the last day, the second day. So you see, what he did in a year, he composed in his head, overnight. I don't know, over the day or on the spot. But let me show you. Wow. Let me show you a screen share.
That's a great story.
It is a great story. Does it matter if it's true? No. The point is that people could envision people like making up on the spot or practically on the spot or no? You see the point? Because we can't know if it's true. We absolutely, how would we know? How could we? Like,
so it's the legend told about those two poems, Piyutim.
Right. But the fact that it could be told shows that in the consciousness of the tellers, this is the kind of thing that could go on.
Okay.
You see why that's important, yes?
For sure.
Yeah. Like today, probably no one would make up that story because everybody knows how you pray. You pray straight out of the Siddur, like as that Karaite rabbi told you. He'd say, you didn't pray. Yeah. Right. This is a world where you could get up and in front of everybody, you could, what do you call, what was it called? Like a rap battle?
You ad-lib.
You ad-lib, yeah. But again, it's within the structure of the alphabet. It's within the structure of the brachot. That's what's very important. It's not just getting up and saying butterflies like that.
Right. No, it has a fixed structure and it has a poetical meter or rhyme or something.
Right. Okay. Okay. It may follow the verses of a biblical book. Here, I am going to. Do you see my screen?
It's starting to come up. I see it now. Yep.
Okay. So this is of me serving as cantor. This is the regular second blessing of I should say this. Later on, in Europe, what happens is because the day-to-day texts get sanctified and the idea, which we've been talking about a lot, this idea, oh my gosh, you didn't actually say the words that have been fixed. You didn't pray. Becomes more and more of an idea. And therefore, what ends up happening is that the tradition developed such that the standard text of the bracha is set. And with few exceptions, there are cases where the standard text actually gets dropped and only the piyyut is said. But where the standard text is said, and then before the closing doxology, the piyyut is recited.
Okay.
And then the doxology is. So the first thing you're going to see here is...
Give us the commentary before we see it, and then just play the video, and then give the commentary after.
What do you mean?
I mean, don't try to talk over the video or nobody's going to hear you.
So the first thing you're going to see here is you're going to hear the words of the... It starts at the second bracha of the Shemona Esrei because the video got cut off. Meaning the video didn't start till the second one. But it's going to start with the regular words that are said every day. Ata gibor la'olam Hashem machayim itim ata rav lo'shia. You are mighty. You resurrect the dead. And then before the Chatima, I'm going to pause. The congregation is going to say the piyyut, which is, again, definitely not historically how they were intended, because how's the congregation supposed to know the words, especially if you're ad-libbing it? But it did become because this idea of once you print them in the book, how can you rely on the cantor to say them? Everyone has to say them.
Yeah.
But what I did here actually was still nonetheless very creative and somewhat revolutionary in that once they say it, I don't just say the last line and then go into the Chatima. I say the whole piyyut. And then what you'll see with some of the harchavot, expansions. So in the blessing about God vanquishing evil, which actually is what we talked about, it's part of the same bracha we talked about, Birkat Aminim, but it's not just about heretics. It talks about evil, the evil empire. So on Purim, which celebrates the vanquishing of the evil enemies of the Jews at the time of the Persians, what the Kaliri did, Elazar Ber Kilir, is you have for each bracha, there's a little piyyut, and then he made a huge expansion in that blessing so he could tell the whole story.
Okay.
So look at
אשר נחמר ויחיה בחן ספרו צץ לצידים שיחיה יצא למור בגשמים מחיה ברוך אתה אדוני וחיי המסים.
So in that one, it was telling various things about it began with the word hamelech, because the way this piyyut works is the Kaleri found 2 verses with exactly 18 words in the book of Esther, one of which talks about the rise to greatness of Mordecai, the other of which talks about the rise to greatness of Esther. It's genius. He found verses with the right number of words, which adjust the right topics. The 2 main heroes, their rise to glory. One of them is Vayehav HaMelech et Esther mikol hanashim vatisachen v'chesed lefanav mikol habetulot. The king loved Esther out of all the women, and she found favor in his eyes out of all the virgins. And the other is Mordechai yatsa milifnei HaMelech bilvush malchut techelet bachur. Mordechai went forth in front of the king in royal raiment, royal blue and white linen. So in each, these are perfect verses, and he splits them up such that the first word that you heard of the piyyut in the first bracha is Vayehav, and he loved. Now, in the verse, Vayehav is talking about the king. The king loved Esther, and the kind of love it's talking, it means sexual lust. But he weaves it into a sentence. He starts Vayehav omein yetomat hegen. The omein, the one who raised Mordecai, loved the wonderful orphan. Meaning, and it's a very different kind of love there. Leaving aside the Septuagint, but which translates as Mordecai took Esther as a wife. But in the next stanza, the one which you heard here, I begin Hamelech b'cheis chak the king declared at the throne of God. The king there is God. In the verse, it was the king loved Esther. The king was the king of Persia, the emperor of Persia, Ahasuerus. So he's using the skeleton of the verses, but the words don't have to mean what they meant in the verse. And the last line before the conclusion, Yatzala Marero Mor Bigshamim Machaya. Mor, Mordechai, was called Mor, like a myrrh, the fragrant myrrh. He went forth to embitter Haman, Lemarero, which is, again, playing with the sound of the words, because bitterness is the opposite of the fragrance of myrrh. I mean, I guess if you tasted it, it probably wouldn't be very sweet.
But they sound similar is the point.
They sound similar. And what did he do it? Big Shami Mahaya, with the power of God, who is the one who resurrects with rain. So he's talking about the rain is because in the winter you're supposed to mention rain, and in the summer dew because of the seasons. And so he worked that in, and then that he mentioned resurrection there at the end. Shamim Mahaya doesn't even have to do resurrecting; it's just been giving life. Rain gives life in the world as it is, but it fits with resurrection. I'm going to skip now to, as we said, the Harhavot, the section, the expansions in the bracha about vanquishing evil. So he has as we see here, like a short stanza, which fits this whole structure where you're going. Each stanza has a successive word from this verse and from that verse, biblical verses, and it has a successive letter of the alphabet and the acrostic, and an acrostic from his name. And then it expands. So where is this? Okay, we're almost at it. That was the blessing king who loves righteousness and justice. Now, this next bracha is the Birkat Aminim, which again is against heretics, but the focus here is more against evil. And
ויוסם לילה ושנומה הניע ליל אשר תנין ביורי וניע לדורוס או הצניע לחיוס לפלאות צנוע לחד זד יהיר השמורה הכניע וסחריך יחמב שח זדים מכניע אזרח פות חוץ, וחסל גהוץ, נסיב נחוץ, סוחס צייס חוץ, במו עדה, פיתול ידע ופילולו נודע, ביודו עד עדה, גמולו חיבל, בעולם מסובל, ועונו בסבל, קודם נסבל, דולי יופלו דאוס, 400, בבנס יובל לאוס, עד דוחש אוס, הרים צחתי לג, ועוס פילג, וענום מילג, בצלמון משלג, וסנים כזומם, וביום זומם, בגיחו אומם, באצבע הומם, זוהו לו עזים, מיצח מעיזים, וכפו ועזים כנבל רעוזים, אכל צבא פרקו, וססה אופראו, ובת בנו סוקראו, מול אב בזרעו.
I like to imagine that
So you were
when the
rapping
Galeri
that.
got up and said it the first time ever and no one had heard the words, that it was something like that. The power of it. First of all, the short lines with the constant rhymes totally fit the genre of rap. But the expressiveness, again, we can't know what their music was like. But the problem is today, most of this would just be, as you saw, the congregational mumbling, often without even the cantor saying it all, which makes no sense since this is the cantor's, first of all, this is the cantor's prayer. And second of all, how were the people supposed to know it? Now, today we have prayer books. So today, when it's fixed and it's printed, everyone can follow along. Here's the problem. People can't really. It's really hard. They're stumbling over the words and nobody's to interpret it for them because as you see in rapping it, and in singing it, I was interpreting it. But cantors don't know how to interpret it because they don't understand the words either. And if it just goes silent, then the cantor doesn't have to understand it because the cantor doesn't have to do anything. And ultimately, I think this, in the long run, is what led to the demise and what led to the dropping of piyyut in most communities outside of certain occasions, as you mentioned, Yom Kippur, and even then, more and more cutting a lot and replacing it with other things like very long silent prayer. And let's watch a little more of this.
Okay.
This is talking about the Israelites. He starts the story of Purim with Abraham.
Yeah.
And he goes very quickly from Abraham through going out of Egypt. And he was just on El Shur no Sharu. And to Shur, to the wilderness of Shur, which is the crossing of the sea. It says that it's Uel Midbar Shur. The next word, actually, Hebrew is, of course, written without vowels, typically, is the next word nosharu, nusharu, or nasharu. And does it mean, most likely, I think it's nusharu, and it means they were eagled. It's a nonce word. It's an invented word. They were brought al kanfei nesharim. God says, I will bring you out on eagle's wings. So he makes a verb from it. They were eagled. Now, there are other interpretations, whether it's actually to be pronounced slightly differently and mean something different. That's my favorite. But it just shows you how each of these words, because they're invented words, and he's playing, he's using all of the tools he has in his toolbox to create. And so you get questions of, what does the word mean? What is he alluding to? What biblical verse? Is there a rabbinic tradition that he's alluding to? Maybe it's a tradition we don't even know about. So, well, at
Gabriel,
this point,
let's,
right after they cross the Red Sea, that's when Amalek comes. And that's the beginning of the story of Haman, because Haman is called the Agagite. Agag is the king of Amalek. And
יוקשו אמורים, שוב לגי חמורים ומחשובים מורים, נסמרו למורים. קישר ציר תחה, לוט פוחושי צחן, להמתיק מר למחכן, לבלו קוד מבוחן, לובו לאלים, ואף להתאלים, ונוקובו אלים, בצדק בני אלים, מיהרו לאולוש, וכל בצק בילוש, ורוגנו בפילוש, עדי דוק חולוש.
let me skip to here.
Gabriel, we got to wrap it up here. So this has been amazing, Gabriel. You're a philologist who studies piyyut, liturgical poetry, And here we had a poem from, that was Elazar Kalir who wrote that poem?
6th to 7th century, yes.
6th to 7th century.
Then the Rebbe Kalir. Elazar son
So
of Kalir.
it's from around, let's call it 1,300 years ago, or 1,400 years ago, actually.
Yes. Yeah, we're in the
7th century,
21st now.
600.
What?
So 1,400-year-old poem, liturgical poem, and you are not just researching it and interpreting it and deciphering it, you're actually reciting it as part of an actual liturgical service, and you're doing it in a modern way with rap. I think that's this beautiful combination. I think if I had gone to a synagogue like this as a child, I might not have been so bored out of my mind. We had, when I was growing up,
maybe piyyut would have been your favorite part.
It might have been, but instead,
If it was done like this?
Instead, they had a literally an opera singer who would come in, and I called it the yodeling, because he would, maybe it wasn't yodeling technically, but he would do like all these flourishes where it would take him like 3 minutes to say one word. And I said to my mother, I'm so bored. And she said, well, if God likes opera, we're all going to have zchus. We're all going to be blessed. So
let's just say that what's it called? The cantorial style that you're talking about was also something very powerful in the 19th, early 20th century. By the time we were kids, it had become Rococo, and the people, what's it called? The practitioners were, there were some people who could do it well, most couldn't. Congregations didn't appreciate it anymore because, again, like rap, it all depends on the what is the word? It's a word with an R. I think it's a French word. The interplay between the performer, in this case, the cantor, and the congregation, and the understanding because. Again, I'm sure the one in your synagogue when you were growing up was probably not very good at it.
He was actually a very skilled opera singer, and I mean, literally, he was an opera singer.
It was literally, that's what he did.
But he didn't understand any of the words.
That's the worst.
I'm sure he didn't.
That's the worst. The most.
And we certainly didn't understand as he was yodeling.
I go to Baltimore every 2 weeks, and I meet with an old cantor who's 93 years old.
Yeah.
And he's really into preserving really the lost tradition of Eastern Ashkenazic cantorial art. And he says, the most important thing is you understand the words, you interpret the words, and you have that feeling that you're at Shamayim, that fear of heaven, that when you're saying them, you mean the words, you understand them, and what you're doing is interpreting the words. And I think that's also what I was doing in the rapping.
That's beautiful.
And then when you interpret them, the people don't need to understand the meaning of every single word because you're communicating I'm just thinking, if that opera singer had been a rapper and didn't understand the words of this piyyut, and by the way, the number of people who do understand the words of this piyyut in the world today is probably under 15. And it would just be awful. I can just imagine like having no idea. It's not about the genre. It's about knowing what you're doing. No?
Right. Yeah. This has been wonderful. Thanks so much, Gabriel, for joining us. And this has been a wonderful conversation. Not the kind of conversation the audience would normally have access to. So I really want to thank you.
Thanks.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.